You've noticed something about yourself. People seem drawn to you at first. Conversations are deep, connections feel real, but then, slowly, something shifts. The distance appears. Messages become shorter. Plans fade. Energy changes. And if you're honest, part of you already saw it coming. But what you don't realize is that the distance didn't start with them. It started inside you. And that's where it gets uncomfortable, because pushing people away doesn't always look like rejection. Sometimes it looks like independence. Sometimes it looks like emotional intelligence. Sometimes it even looks like kindness, short sentence. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. Here's what's really going on. You don't consciously decide to push people away. No one sits there thinking, I'm going to sabotage this connection. The pattern is quieter than that. It's built into the way your mind scans people, the way your nervous system reacts to closeness, the way your identity protects itself. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern usually starts with something subtle, hyper-awareness. You read people well, too well. You notice micro shifts in tone, small pauses in conversation, slight changes in body language. Most people miss these signals. You don't. Your brain runs constant pattern recognition in the background. You track inconsistencies, emotional undercurrents, hidden motives. It feels like emotional intelligence, but sometimes it's something else. Hypervigilance. And hypervigilance isn't just awareness. It's a nervous system that learned early that closeness can turn unpredictable. So now, even in calm environments, your mind keeps scanning, looking for the moment things change, looking for proof, and eventually you find it. Not because it's always there, but because your brain expects it to be. Pause for a second and ask yourself something honestly. When someone starts getting closer to you, what's the first thing your mind does? Does it relax, or does it start analyzing? Because for many people who push others away without realizing it, closeness triggers observation mode. You begin watching them more closely. You notice small flaws, inconsistencies, moments where their behavior doesn't match their words, and slowly your internal narrative begins forming. Maybe they're not as genuine as they seemed. Maybe they'll eventually hurt you. Maybe this connection isn't safe. But here's the part that's difficult to admit. Some of those interpretations are real, and some of them are projections. When someone has experienced unstable relationships earlier in life, emotionally distant parents, unpredictable affection, or trauma bonding dynamics, the brain learns a simple rule: attachment equals risk. So the mind develops protective strategies. One of them is emotional distancing. Another is quiet self-sabotage. And self-sabotage rarely looks dramatic. It looks like small shifts. You respond slightly slower. You share slightly less. You become subtly harder to reach. You stop leaning in. Not because you want distance, because part of you expects disappointment. And the strange thing is, the other person feels it. Humans are incredibly sensitive to emotional regulation cues. When someone withdraws their openness, even slightly, the nervous system of the other person reacts. They feel the distance. They pull back. And then your mind says something dangerous. See, I knew it. But what you're seeing isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's a reaction, a mirror, another uncomfortable question. Have you ever noticed how quickly admiration can turn into quiet criticism in your mind? Someone seems fascinating at first, different, interesting. But the moment they get closer, your brain starts noticing the cracks, their insecurity, their inconsistency, their emotional reactions, and slowly the image changes. This isn't random. It's a form of identity protection. If someone gets too close, they gain influence over your emotional world. They can affect your mood, your stability, your sense of safety. So the mind does something clever. It lowers their value. Not consciously, but subtly. You begin seeing them as less aligned, less mature, less aware. And once that shift happens, distance feels justified. But there's another layer most people never examine: fear of visibility. Being truly seen sounds appealing in theory, but psychologically, it's extremely vulnerable. When someone understands you deeply, they gain access to parts of you that are normally hidden. Your contradictions, your unresolved pain, your emotional triggers. For people who spent years developing social masking, learning how to appear composed, thoughtful, self-contained, this level of exposure can feel dangerous. So the moment someone starts getting close enough to see behind the mask, your system reacts. You pull back. You create space. You convince yourself the connection wasn't right anyway. Short sentence. Protection complete. But there's a cost, and it accumulates slowly. At first, the pattern feels like discernment. You tell yourself you simply have high standards. You're selective. You value depth over superficial relationships. And some of that is true. But over time, something else happens. Your world becomes smaller. Not socially, emotionally. You meet people, you connect briefly, but few relationships survive the moment when closeness begins requiring vulnerability. And eventually, a quiet belief forms. No one really understands me. But here's the paradox. If people can't reach you, they can't understand you. And that's where cognitive dissonance begins. Part of you wants deep connection, but another part protects your independence so aggressively that connection never fully stabilizes. Two opposing drives operating at the same time. And the tension between them can make relationships feel exhausting. You want closeness, but you also monitor it constantly. You want honesty, but you brace for disappointment. You want someone to stay, but part of you prepares for their exit from the beginning. So, what happens? You control the distance first, not dramatically, just enough, just early enough. So if things collapse, you weren't the one caught off guard. But there's a moment of clarity many people eventually reach, a quiet realization. The problem isn't that people are always disappointing. The problem is that your nervous system learned to anticipate disappointment before trust even had time to form. And anticipation shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce beliefs. The cycle continues, but awareness interrupts patterns. Not instantly, but gradually. Because once you see how your mind protects itself, something shifts. You start noticing the moment your brain begins scanning for flaws, the moment admiration turns into subtle criticism, the moment emotional distance begins forming. And instead of immediately obeying that instinct, you pause. You ask a different question. Am I seeing clearly, or am I protecting myself? Sometimes the answer will still be distance. Not every connection is healthy. Not every person deserves access to you. But sometimes, the distance was never about them. It was about an old system trying to prevent an old pain. And that realization changes the entire pattern, because pushing people away isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's a reflex, a learned survival strategy, one that once kept you safe. But safety and isolation often wear the same disguise. The real shift begins when you recognize the difference, when you allow someone to remain close long enough to experience something unfamiliar: consistency, emotional steadiness, trust that builds slowly instead of exploding intensely. It may feel strange at first, even uncomfortable. Your mind will still look for reasons to retreat. That's normal. Patterns built over years don't dissolve overnight, but awareness gives you choice, and choice changes identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who simply doesn't connect with most people. Instead, you begin noticing the invisible distance you used to create, the quiet walls, the subtle exits. And when those walls become visible, they lose their automatic power, because pushing people away was never the real goal. The real goal was protection. Protection from unpredictability, from abandonment, from being seen too clearly. But sometimes the very defenses that protected you also kept you alone. And the strange thing is, once you truly understand that pattern, you start noticing something else. The distance you thought other people created was often the distance you built first.